brief so that we can get as much from Professor Schelling as possible?
I'm Stan Weiss, Professor Emeritus Psychology. With respect to the Yom Kippur War, I had heard, it's not really documented as far as I know, but I had heard that Israel was not receiving the supplies that they needed in order to defend themselves at the rate from Kissinger and Nixon that they felt was warranted, and indicated that if they were pressed to the extreme, they'd be forced to use nuclear weapons, and the rate of resupply increased. Now, I was wondering if you know anything about that.
I mean, there's something about it that, you see, during the Yom Kippur War, when the United States was trying to resupply Israel with ammunition and replacement equipment, not a single NATO nation permitted the United States to refuel its airplanes. So transports of ammunition and equipment to Israel had to fly all the way from the United States to Israel nonstop, because Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, nobody along the way would permit the U.S. to refuel. And that meant planes carried only about half the supplies that they could otherwise carry, because they had to have enough fuel that they could have doubled what they carried if they could refuel along the way. Portugal was a member of NATO, and Portugal, like France, wouldn't allow the U.S. to refuel, but Portugal controlled the Azores. And the Azores are just off the northwest coast of Africa. And they allowed the United States to stop in the Azores and refuel at an airfield that had adequate facilities. And that essentially allowed planes to double what they could carry to Israel. I've heard two things about Israeli attitude toward nuclear weapons. One is that they may have said that if they couldn't get sufficient supplies, they would be forced to use nuclear weapons. If they said that, I don't know whether it would have been a bluff or not. The other thing I've heard is that somewhere along the way, Egypt, I don't know about Syria, but Egypt, in the person of Anwar Sadat, indicated to the Israelis that they had no desire for anything other than to recover the Sinai Peninsula, and that they had no interest in pursuing military invasion of Israel proper. That could explain their non-use of nuclear weapons. What we don't know is, or what I have no way of knowing, is whether Israel communicated to the Egyptian government that if their border was penetrated, they would be forced to use nuclear weapons. And if so, whether they said they would be forced to use tactical military use, battlefield use, or whether they would threaten Cairo. And my guess is we'll never know.
I'm going to go to Professor Wannis next, and then I would encourage a student to jump into the fray here.
Thank you, Professor Schelling. Anthony Winnie St. John, teaching negotiation here at the School of International Service. I wanted to ask you about unilateral restraints in situations of conflict. Would reassurances of restraint be useful, for example, in encouraging North Korea to change its behaviors, rather than escalating threats?
What kind of restraints did you have in mind?
Well, the avoidance of threats of invasion, the avoidance of threats of eliminating the regime, would they be counterproductive? Would they be possibly less constructive than the opposite?
Okay, I quite strongly believe that the North Korean leaders are smart enough to know that it would be suicidal for them personally, the people who decide to use nuclear weapons, and that they wouldn't dare to use nuclear weapons unless they were invaded, in which case they might use nuclear weapons locally against an invasion force in order to cause a huge gasp around the world and cause the invasion to be stopped. I don't think they're crazy enough not to know that they wouldn't have a chance. I tend to feel the same way about Iran. They feel that they have one of the oldest civilizations in the current world. They think of themselves as directly inheritors of the Persian history, and that they have a language and a history that goes back more than 3,000 years. And the idea that they would give all of that up just in the hopes that out of the Holocaust that resulted, some kind of a Muslim, well, I don't know the appropriate religious word for it, something would arise out of it of the sort that they're willing to die for. I don't see how they could believe any such stupid thing. And I don't think they're stupid. And they may be very passionate about their religion. But I don't think we threaten Islam. And we certainly don't threaten their Islam. So, but a specific question, should we be threatening to invade? And I think this is more likely in Iran than in North Korea. My preference is no. I think the United States doesn't want, again, to get a reputation for launching war I would say to prevent something they don't like. We never did anything like threaten Pakistan. Or India. And the idea that it's okay for the USA, Russia, China, France, Britain, India, Pakistan, to get nuclear weapons. But all of a sudden Iran somehow threatens either Israel or the United States or somebody. I just think we should, in a way, call their bluff and say, we're confident that the Ayatollah is smart enough to know that he can't use nuclear weapons offensively. And if he wants them defensively, let him have them. They're expensive. They're going to have a whole lot of domestic issues to deal with. Who's going to have custody of the weapons? Will it be the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, or the Revolutionary Guard, or will the weapons be kept in the vaults of the central bank and delivered to the military during a crisis? How would you explain your policy toward nuclear weapons? China, for example, way back in 1964, when it first exploded a nuclear device, said that it would never be the first to use nuclear weapons in any kind of conflict. And it continues to say that. And the United States often was asked, could the president issue a no first use statement? This was back in the days of the USSR. And I think the US position had to be, if we try to deliver a secure policy of no first use, then the Germans will ask, does that mean that if the Soviets attack us, you won't use nuclear weapons to defend us? And I think the United States didn't want to answer yes and didn't want to answer no, and decided the best thing was to leave it unspoken. But Iran, when it gets nuclear weapons, is going to have to make a lot of decisions. And I think it's possible to trust that they don't have to be awfully rational to know that they're better off without a nuclear exchange. So I think, and this is getting back to the question you actually asked me, I think we needn't be so threatening, either with North Korea or Iran.
Thank you. Interesting. That was student? Yes, go ahead.
My name is Brett Collup, International Economic Relations Program. I'm very honored to have you speak here today. I'm a huge fan of your books. And I'd like to ask you a question about the stabilizing factor of nuclear weapons. As you've seen since we've had nuclear weapons, or if you said, and we can all see, we haven't had a great power war. But we also have the contradictory element of brinksmanship and tripwires and imperfect information. Do you think that nuclear weapons do play a positive role in the world for peace and stability?
I think you can only get stability in a world of nuclear weapons if you understand it and work at it. The United States, for almost 15 years after the first use of nuclear weapons, didn't really understand the requirements for stability. It was in 1957 that something called the Gaither Committee, headed by Rowan Gaither of the University of California, issued a report that was agreed to by the U.S. Air Force to the effect that deterring a Soviet attack required that the United States have a retaliatory force that could not be destroyed in the attack it was intended to deter. And that the entire U.S. retaliatory force depended on U.S.-based bomber aircraft that were located on a very small number of fields. And it would only take a very small number of airplanes coming across the distant early warning line in northern Canada to destroy our entire retaliatory fleet so that they would have clear chance to ask for our surrender. And then in 1958, when Eisenhower and Khrushchev agreed to have a conference on measures to safeguard against surprise attack, the whole U.S. government had to think about what is the problem of surprise attack. And they finally came to the conclusion the problem of surprise attack is a problem of the security of our retaliatory force. And then the United States, almost in desperation, invented what they called the airborne retaliatory forces, according to which a significant fraction of the entire U.S. bomber force would be in the air all the time, heading toward Soviet targets. They would turn around when they reached the Soviet radar perimeter, and their places would be taken, and we would simply keep continuously maybe 15% of the bomber force in the air heading toward the Soviet Union, so that even if they destroyed everything on the ground, they would still get dreadfully hurt. And that's when we abandoned our two main missile programs, the Atlas and the Titan, because they were liquid-fueled missiles that took about 3 hours to prepare for launch. And just about that same time, 1969-70, the Soviets began to test what looked like intercontinental missiles. And it was estimated that when they had those missiles, their flight time to U.S. targets would be about 30 minutes, and Atlas and Titan could all be destroyed on the ground before they could get off the ground. And that's when we went in for the ground-based Minuteman program, which were small missiles small enough they could be easily be put underground, and being solid fueled, they could launch on demand. And we went in for the Polaris system, which was a submarine-based system, which was thought to be beyond any Soviet ability to target submarines. And that essentially meant that we had a pretty secure retaliatory force. And Secretary McNamara, in along about 1962, I think, 2 or 3, was being interrogated by the Senate on this subject of stability. And he said, we are moving to make our retaliatory force invulnerable. And then he added, and we are encouraging the Soviets to do the same at home. And the senators asked him, we can understand why you want us to be invulnerable, but why don't you want the Soviets vulnerable? And he said, the only conceivable circumstances in which the Soviets would possibly dare to attack us would be if they thought that we were about to attack them. We want them to know that we will never engage in a first strike against them, so that they will never have any reason to believe that war is inevitable and they better be the ones to start it. And I think this is a long, interesting history of a certain kind of stability. I just finished writing a foreword to a book called Strategic Stability, which is all about stability between China and Russia, and stability in the Middle East, and stability in the Korean Peninsula, and all of those. And stability now, you have to almost identify every pair or triplet of potentially hostile countries to each other to talk about what kind of stability they need and how they can get it. But at least between us and, I believe now, certainly China, and absolutely certainly Russia, we've understood stability long enough. But as I said, it took almost 15 years to learn the simple, I won't call it the simple mathematics, but the simple analytics of nuclear stability.
Come over here. I know you have been waiting very patiently over here.
Leroy Miller, Washington semester program. I teach global economics and business, and I grew up on that book too in undergraduate work with the strategy of conflict. Wanted to thank you for writing that book. My question comes to back to the underlying question of rationality in decision making, and it appears in the answer that you've given on Korea and on Iran that you see an inherently rational state actor. My question goes to non-state actors, and also to, in that sense, people that we may abhor, right, like North Korea or, being a state actor, but non-state actors such as the Boston bombers or the potential for a nuclear device being ignited by non-state actors. And the question is, to what extent can we use the concept of rationality to understand their behavior?
I want to make 2 points about that. The first is, 30 years ago, I believed that non-state actors would have nuclear weapons within a decade. And I went to a conference in Israel that Benjamin Netanyahu organized on terrorism, and my topic was nuclear terrorism. And I said, and then I published, that sometime in the 1980s, a non-state actor organization is likely to get a nuclear weapon. If not in the 80s, then surely in the 90s. Well, about 3 years ago, I began to ask myself, it's been 30 years. As far as we know, they've never got them, and I think we would know it if they had. Why don't they have it? And then I realized that the people who were so concerned about stolen fissile material that might get into the hands of Al-Qaeda or somebody, Norman Lugar, for example, and my former colleague and student, Graham Allison, former dean of the Kennedy School, he published a book in 2004 in which he said, it is more likely than not that in the coming decade, an American city will be destroyed by a terrorist nuclear bomb. Well, within a year to the end of that decade, but that doesn't prove anything because he never said it was certain. He only said it's more likely than not. And you can't prove him wrong because it didn't happen. But I've been asking myself, if it was all that easy for somebody to steal the fissile material from supplies located all over in the former Soviet Union, why hasn't it happened? And I began to think, well, first, it's a little like the question when people stole half a dozen very precious paintings from the art museum in Boston. How are they going to find customers? You can't advertise in the New York Times, I have a Picasso. It's yours for $20 million. And I thought the people who probably were in a position to steal precious fissile material, weapons grade, weren't especially clever at knowing, how do I find a customer? Especially if my customer is somewhere in Afghanistan or Libya or even the United States. He would have to find a go-between probably, partly because he won't speak the same language as his customer will. He may not have visas to go to wherever the customer is. He may not have any good way of knowing how to find a customer. And once he begins to blab that he's looking for a customer, the CIA or the Israeli Mossad or somebody is likely to hear him and confront him. So it may be awfully hard to profit from stealing some of that stuff, especially if they can steal only a very small amount, so they'll have to keep stealing all the time until they cultivate a market. And my fantasy is that when finally somebody who's been entrusted with all of this valuable stuff, who either had to promise to pay for it after he sold it or had enough money to invest in it himself, by the time the person who has the stolen material meets a representative of the terrorist organization, they probably meet in an open marketplace with plenty of bodyguards camouflaged in the surroundings. And they sit down at the table and get ready to exchange 150 grams of plutonium in return for $150,000. They recognize each other. One is from the US CIA and the other is from the Israeli Mossad. And each was in a sting operation. They smile, shake hands, and go on about their business. And I think the same is sort of true of finding the team to make the bomb. Much is made of the fact that how to make a nuclear bomb is simply no more a secret. On the other hand, it's like anybody can find out how to make my refrigerator. But it's going to be hard for me to go out and find people who've ever built a refrigerator. There's no secret how to make a Chevrolet. But, you know, if I were secretly trying to find people who would make a Chevrolet, and the making it is prohibited, it'd be hard to find people who knew all of the technologies, the metallurgy and everything, to start from scratch. And to make a nuclear bomb requires probably a couple of dozen very skilled technicians, metallurgists and people who know how to build things to fine tolerances, people who, if it's going to be a plutonium bomb, know how to handle dangerous material. It would be possible to find, maybe, dedicated terrorists who'd be willing to go to MIT and get a degree in nuclear engineering. Then you've got to find a bunch more who will go and learn machining techniques and all of that somewhere. If you try to get these people in return for money, then if they're smart, they're likely to think, if you're willing to try to kill 100,000 people with a nuclear bomb, you wouldn't hesitate to kill me once I've done my job. Instead of paying me, you should just shoot me and bury me in the backyard, because then I can't go to the CIA and squeal on you for a profit. So it may be not only awfully difficult to get the stolen material in the hands of people who can use it, but very difficult to gather together a team of people who would have to leave their jobs and leave their families and go in isolation and work. But then the question arises, and let's get back to your question about rationality. If this bunch of very well-educated, highly civilized people have just built a bomb or two or three, what will they talk about all this time that they're secluded and working on a bomb? And I think they'll talk about what's the right thing to do with this bomb. And they will end up having talked about that probably more than any national security advisor in any government has ever spent thinking about it. Probably more than any person who strategizes about nuclear policy or even nuclear terrorist policy. They're likely to conclude we shouldn't waste this bomb to destroy Los Angeles or Vladivostok or Berlin or Jerusalem. It used to be there was America, Russia, France, Britain, China. Now there's India, Pakistan, North Korea, maybe Iran. We're the 11th nuclear power in the world. We're ahead of 180-some countries in having the primary weapon of mass destruction. What can we use it for? Probably we can use it for diplomacy. Maybe we want to be recognized for what we can do with this weapon. Maybe we should get representation in the United Nations General Assembly or the Security Council, because we are a nuclear power. We're just as important as North Korea or Iran. We may not have as much bomb material as Pakistan, but we're big stuff. But they might also, and if they're rational, which was, I think they're likely to say, let's decide what we can accomplish by threatening to use the bomb. Suppose, for example, they want the United States to get out of Afghanistan. First, they have to prove they have the bomb. I don't think that's going to be hard because I've talked to people in the nuclear weapons business and asked, if you were invited to go somewhere, maybe blindfolded, to discover whether a terrorist organization has in fact built a bomb, to go and find out and come back and tell the President of the United States whether it's true or not, would you go? And I've had the response, of course I would. The only reason they would be inviting me is that they want me to see with my own eyes and come back and verify that they're not bluffing. Either that, or if he doesn't want to go by invitation, they can kidnap him. Take him, tell him, we're here for you to see with your own eyes, and we'll take you home safely. Then my plan is that they say, now that we have let the public know and the President of the United States know that we have a nuclear weapon, or a few nuclear weapons, here is our proposition. We have already located a weapon that you can't find that could be detonated at a distance in one of the following 10 cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, Houston, San Diego, Seattle, San Francisco. If you're not out of Afghanistan by New Year's Day 2014, that weapon that's in one of those cities will explode. You can't stop it. It is so designed that if you could locate it, you wouldn't dare touch it because we have triggered it, fused it so that it will go off if it's interfered with. Now, I think that would be a very rational use. And I have a hunch that anybody who's smart enough to organize this team to build the nuclear weapon and to find the material he needs somewhere in the world, he's probably smart enough to think about how to get the most mileage out of this bomb that he has. And notice, if New Year's Eve comes and we're not out of Afghanistan, tens of millions of people will be evacuated. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, just loading the whole family and the dog and cat and sandwiches in the station wagon and driving safely out into the countryside, recognizing that all the police and the firemen are doing the same thing, that all of the hospitals are being evacuated. And then, after all of that, if the terrorist wants to say, "Ha-ha, look what I accomplished. I'm not going to blow up your city. You've already shown the world that we're a powerful diplomatic organization and we can behave at least as rationally as any of you." So I tend to think, yeah, you don't have to be awfully rational to respond the way rationality analysis sometimes seems to work. When James here talked about children not being always easy to strategize with, I think that's often because kids are good at strategy. They know that if they want to do something prohibitive, they shouldn't let you see them beginning to do it, because if you tell them not to, then they have to stop. But if you haven't told them not to, they go ahead and do it. And I think small children understand a lot of this stuff. In fact, I just wrote a blurb for a book. I don't know how many of you read 18th century British literature, but there's a book called Jane Austen, Game Theorist. And I was asked for a blurb, so I got the manuscript and I read it. And she's a game theorist. You know, most game theorists think about military, crime and punishment, business negotiations, diplomacy, deterring terrorists and all of that. But there are game theorists who think about romantic relationships and social status and the kinds of things that go on among men and women in various societies, and the relations between the upper and the lower, and the master of the house and the servants and so forth, always in some kind of strategic relationship. And it's evident that Jane Austen really understood game theory as well as I do, and I think I understand it fairly well. And so that I think that there are lots of people engaged in various kinds of bargaining who know a lot of the principles that game theory would lead them to. So I don't think you have to be unusually rational in order to behave rationally in most circumstances. Most people would rather be alive than dead.
There's a good place to end. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. We're so appreciative that you came over. We hope you'll, since you're a neighbor, we hope you'll come back and visit us again. We've got there are a couple other events the university is putting on next week as part of the series commemorating the 50th anniversary of the 1963 commencement speech. On Monday here in SIS, we have Meet the Press host David Gregory with Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren to talk about whether a strategy of peace as enunciated by JFK in 1963 is applicable to looking at the Middle East today. And then the School of Communication is hosting an event on May 1st at the museum with Nick Clooney and Tom Brokaw. So thank you guys so much for coming. And again, Tom, thank you so much for being here.